We are back again, Scott. I mean, you look great. How's it going?
Well, it's been a rough semester, but we made it and had a lot of joyful moments with my students and a lot of breakthrough moments. So I think it was all well worth it. But we're hanging in there. How about you?
It's been pretty good. Yeah, I'm in a pretty remote area of the world, so it's been pretty peaceful. Um, but it's been really a lot of rain and flooding and stuff, so it's been a little crazy. Yeah,
Are you in the Northwest or
I
where are you at?
am. I
Okay,
am. I'm right in Washington State, right on the border of Canada, which got hit really hard with all the massive flooding
right.
up this way with the site with the atmospheric rivers, all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I had a couple friends up that way, or a couple of colleagues, and they finally sent an email out and they said we've been offline for 3 weeks or something like that. So,
Yeah. It's
yeah.
been crazy, yeah. But I mean, overall, though, it's been really good and heading into the holidays. So a lot to be thankful for. I feel like enjoy the stuff that I have.
Exactly, exactly.
So when you contacted me about chatting, we were talking about the topic of deep fakes is very, very interesting to me because it's scary to me on many
Right.
levels. So I want to jump in and your interest in it and how you came to have this interest in it.
Well, last time I was on, we talked a lot about AI, and I know
Yes.
you and your listeners are pretty familiar with that topic and machine learning. And I think that's one of the areas where we can say that the technology is almost neutral,
Hmm.
right? So it kind of, here's all this great stuff we can do in medicine with AI. Oh, here's this all this bad stuff that Facebook does to manipulate our brains and our
Yeah.
dopamine levels. So we can kind of say that, this is something that is kind of like a knife. It can be used to slice bread, and it can be used to, hurt somebody.
Yeah.
So it's in some ways a lot of those examples we have, something on both sides. Well, deep fakes are an application of AI where I think the majority of the applications are really bad.
Yeah.
And while there are some interesting applications, for example, there's something called Descript, where great podcasters like yourself can use it to edit your audio. So if you happen to make a mistake, I know that you would never do that on your
Ever.
podcast, but let's say that you said, join me next Thursday, and
Yeah.
what you really meant was join me next Tuesday. Well, you could go in and you could edit that in text, and it would actually edit your audio track. So
Wow.
it would sound like you. So that's kind of cool. And we start to see this being used in different applications as far as movies and dubbing of movies and things like that that are more effective. But really, the majority of this is being used in some really nefarious ways.
Hmm.
One of the ways is to use these deep fakes to deep fake a person's voice to make an impersonation of them and to commit financial fraud, right? So
Yeah.
you've been out there with your podcast. There's probably enough audio out there where I could train an AI so that whatever I typed into a script, this AI would generate a voice that sounded just like you.
Right.
Well, now I use that to call one of your family members and say, "Hey, I'm up here. What's just happened? I don't know what's going on. I really need some money right now. Can you please wire it to me at this address?"
Yeah.
Or I just got arrested. I don't know what's going on. The cops say I killed somebody. You need to talk to these people and they'll help me out. Okay, you got a sense of urgency, very short amount of time. I just need a little bit of audio. Then you transfer it to somebody like me, right? And then I'm going to say, oh, well, yeah, that's really bad, but we need a down payment
Yeah.
to get this done. Well, that's one example at the level that you and I might operate at. There have actually been tens of millions of dollars scammed from bankers, right? So and from CEOs who basically, it sounds like the CEO is calling and is asking you to transfer money, wire transfer money to this other account. And so that has happened. There's been several reports in the Wall Street Journal about this. But so that's one example of a really bad
Yeah.
application of it. But the other example is what we call non-consensual pornography, right?
Oh,
So being actually able to take someone's image, their face, and put that on uh, the head of a pornographic actor or actress.
hmm,
And this is a crime. This is a crime mainly against, I would say, always against women.
right.
And it's used to intimidate them, to psychologically damage them. And even though we may know it's a deep fake, there is that kind of psychological damage that happens to people, especially, and especially women in our society. And in some societies, this is being used to intimidate women journalists. Okay, so in the Mideast and Muslim countries, there's actually been some instances where a journalist, a female journalist, was had this type of non-consensual pornography created of her, and is an intimidation because she was investigating somebody, right? And so a very dangerous situation, and it's just very scary. And so I just knew that you had a good audience and a sharp
Yeah.
audience and one that cares about their communities. And I kind of wanted to talk just a little bit about these deep fakes and make sure that folks are more aware of them.
Yeah. I think I've known about deep fakes for a while, not on the level that you know. You have a much more in depth. I'm like, whoa, this is going deep. But I saw a special on it. I think it was through the New York Times. They had like a documentary style show, and it was all about deep fakes. And they were talking to these tech guys that they're creating it and the dangers of it. But I wonder also, you talk the criminal nature of it. Do we have the proper, or do we need a separate division of security just for this type of crime?
Well, that's very interesting because once again, technology has kind of gotten ahead of policy or
Right.
regulation. So even for actors that may have their likeness used by a computer to generate an image of them being in a movie
Yeah.
that they aren't actually in. Well, do the actors have, what rights do they have to protect their image? Because when they sign a modeling release, when they actually do a film, well, does that give the right to the producers, the directors of that film to then take that likeness and use it in another film?
Mm.
And so there's a lot of issues there. Do you have the copyright to your face?
Huh.
There's lots of videos of me teaching on Canvas.
Right.
Do I want the University of Missouri to be teaching, have me teaching my courses via a deepfake AI long after I'm dead?
Whoa.
You know?
Whoa.
So, what kind of protections do I have from that? And it's not really
Yeah.
clear at this time.
Doesn't that
So,
feel like most of the internet, it seems like, is like we just did stuff and then didn't have the policy beforehand? It's like, well,
right.
let's just see if this works. Let's create it. But then there's unintended consequences that we don't examine because of lack of policy for it.
Right. Right. And I think until we have that policy and also until we have some technology to be able to verify that this is a genuine audio file, this is a genuine
Mm,
video file, that we have to start protecting our families and especially the older members in our families that may be
yeah.
more likely to be victims of this type of crime.
Yeah.
Having a code word that you and your immediate family know that you can share if there was an incidence where you had an accident or something like that,
Yeah.
and that you know what that code word is and are able to describe that so that you aren't having your grandma or grandpa falling victim to this
Right.
type of scam.
Why do you think most of it's been negative in nature so far?
Um, well, I think there's a couple of things. One is we believe what we see and hear as humans.
Hmm.
So there's some trust that goes along. If I can see you saying something, uh, I'm likely to trust it. if you look me in the eyes and say something, I think there's a lot of cues that we have as human beings in our communication. And so I think that's part of it. There's, I think a lot of reasons why we fall for these types of things. One is these scammers are pretty good, right? So they have the sense of urgency. They have a specific request. There's a time limit on it. So there's there's lots of ways that they build this, and it's built to work, right?
Yeah. Actually, I was just watching a special last night on romance scams, and like Ugandan or Nigerian romance scams, and how they get the pictures of real people, and then they create these scripts, and then generally older people, especially women, end up giving, I think on average, like $10,000 to people. But there are cases of people giving millions of dollars. They think they're in love with somebody that's actually not real.
Right.
But what if you be able to create the actual video of this person? Most of the time it's just pictures. What if now it's like the video of the person? You really think this person's talking to you, Yeah.
I could have a synthetic person that I could be talking with you and charming you and scamming you all via script.
Yeah.
And I could probably be running hundreds of these at the same time. They don't have to all work. Kind of like email phishing scams. Why do you get these old email phishing scams? Well, maybe 1 in a million works, but when you can send a couple million emails a second, that's to a second that you're getting a couple $100 out of.
Yeah.
So there's a reason why those things still exist, and it's unfortunate, and it's usually the people that are older and more vulnerable, or maybe are lonely, or maybe depressed, and they want to believe, right? We all want to be liked. We all want to feel loved, and we want to feel like we're desirable, right? So that's another whole issue in our society, is that desirability and that need to feel desired.
Why don't we do more? Like you talked about the policy and catching up to it. Why does it feel like we're not doing more, or corporations aren't doing more in the immediate term about it? Is it they just don't have the technology for it to do more, or what's the deal currently?
So it's interesting. Facebook, I don't like Facebook, but I will give them this, that they have done a fairly good job of trying to identify these deep fakes, because they have a huge amount of them that get shared every day. So they're able to see the characteristics of these deep fakes, flag them, say, okay, deep fake videos using this technology have these characteristics. Let's pull those off. Okay. And so they've actually put some work behind that and are doing a fairly good job. The problem is that when we get into these things like these one-on-one type of scams, right? And I'm sure you're probably the same. I don't answer any email or any rather number that comes into my cell phone unless it is somebody I know, right? And we need to build a phone network for the modern age, right? So that it's a verified type of system. So there are some systems out there like blockchain, which has obviously been used in cryptocurrency, but it can be used in other ways. That I could basically, my call entry to Darren is going to go into a blockchain, and I have to verify who I am before I make that call. And then you see that and say, okay, that's Scott, and that gets verified. So
yeah, wow. I mean, I feel like I'm hearing these things for the first time, literally. And I'm up to date on a lot of this stuff. So imagine to a lot of people who don't know anything about this. That's what scares me. And then the idea of going into a more virtual reality based existence, like Facebook pushing the metaverse and pushing all this stuff. How deep does that go when we start getting into that level of existence or reality for people?
Yeah, I don't know. There was a platform called Second Life that was there about 12, 15 years ago. And that was very interesting. A lot of people flocked to it. A lot of companies went to it. A lot of universities had entire campuses built in the Second Life system. Now we had a researcher here. He was gentleman that studied African American history, and he actually built the 1930s or 1920s Harlem in Second Life. And then he would teach his classes in this virtual reality system. Used it from your computer. You didn't have a headset or anything.
Yeah.
But he had microphones and whatnot, and he could give tours of it. But it was something that was very useful, right? So that was a nice tool to use in his class. And so there's a lot of friction involved in logging in and using these systems and having an avatar and stuff. It's kind of cool at first, but then you're like, oh, this, takes a lot of work. But he had an interesting setup there where it was actually adding something to the class. He couldn't recreate that in the classroom, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's some applications that may be very good. For example, we might see things like one of our companies here in town is a company called Helium, and they are looking at how can you help people that have PTSD or have other stress-related issues. And they actually put a little brainwave monitor on you, and as well as the virtual reality glasses. And then it's kind of almost like a meditation app, and you're changing the world through by getting calmer. You're making more butterflies fly, and you're getting to concentrate on those. So there may be some quote unquote killer apps in this area that are related to healing. But boy, I don't, Zoom is bad enough. I don't want to, I don't want to be having metaverse calls,
Yeah, I feel like it's you think that this current version of stuff is bad and
Mhm.
bad for you. I think this this is gonna break your brain.
Right.
like what happens when I think this is kind of related to deep fakes, and what happens when something is indistinguishable from your reality?
Right.
What happens when, because there's been lots of movies and things, and the show Devs actually dives into that determinism and the whole thing. What happens when your reality is indistinguishable from an alternate reality? How do humans process that?
Right. And some humans don't process it well, right? So we've seen that with some young males that get addicted to uh, gaming systems, they
Yes.
can actually kind of get themselves so fatigued and tired that they can not understand reality anymore. I would say in some ways, some of the effects of Instagram on young girls has a corollary there. There was recently a study that came out that said that for every one picture that a young woman posts on Instagram, there's like 150 that they don't post.
Hmm.
So think about that self-talk.
Whoa.
So, this one's not good. I look too fat here. Oh no, I don't like the way I look there. There's some other
Yeah.
imperfection. This one's bad. You're doing that 150 times before you find something that's good. Okay, so we talk about realities and virtual realities, but I think what we're also talking about is the reality in our mind,
Yes.
right? So that reality of I don't look good, I am not worthy.
Yeah.
That really disturbs me, and we've in fact seen, increased suicide and self-cutting rates in young females, self-harm rates, and
Yeah.
that's very disturbing. I don't want to get too off topic here, but how do we measure the success of our country? I
Right.
think is another one that we have to consider. GDP is often what we look at.
Right.
Well, Meta creates a lot of GDP, right? Well, lifespan is going down, especially
Right.
for people in our age bracket.
That's true.
Okay. That seems like a more worthwhile indicator, especially as I get older, it seems more worthwhile.
Wait a minute.
Wait a second. Starting to approach that line.
Yeah.
That may be a better indicator to look at. Suicide rate,
Yeah.
self-harm rate. We don't talk about that the way we talk about the stock market or the S&P.
Yeah.
And so I think that's also where we need to, as citizens, kind of drive our focus to.
Yeah. When you, and getting back to deep fakes a little bit, what's the evolution of deep fakes beyond what we currently know? I mean, you mentioned things about, I didn't ever thought about this. You're dead and you're still teaching.
Right.
What, I mean, that blew my mind, by the way. I was like, wait a minute, wait a minute. It's like the digital ghost in the machine, like what is the other future beyond that?
Right. Well, it's not entirely theoretical. There was actually a case, I forget what university, but this professor had designed an entirely online asynchronous course and recorded all these videos. And then he died. And the university was like, well, let's just use his material this semester.
Oh my God.
And so about a week or two into it, when the students were like, I tried emailing the guy, but I get a response that he's dead.
This is crazy. This is crazy.
So they were supposed to email, whoever's the instructor of record, but they tried emailing the guy that they saw in the video, and they started to realize he was dead, and they're like, I'm not paying to be taught by some dead dude.
That's crazy. But imagine if like they took his voice and the voice could respond to the emails or the messages like he was alive.
Right. Yeah, just if you took all my responses to students over the past 10 years and fed them into an AI, you could probably deal with most of the questions I deal with.
You're like, wait a minute, that could be a good thing.
Yeah, wait a second. Maybe I can just automate my life here.
You're like somewhere else vacationing. You're like, no, the class is happening. I mean, people are answering. I'm answering the stuff. Like,
right. So
how does that go? That's like, where does it end? What is a future that has this in it that feels mostly negative?
Right. Well, let me just hit on two things. One is how fast technology moves,
Okay.
and how fast it becomes democratized. And we think of that as generally being a good thing. I've got this device here that probably has close to $1 million worth of equipment that if I was to buy it in the 1990s, it would cost me $1 million for the quality of the video camera, the fax machine that I have in here, the computer I have in here, the fitness tracker I have in here. It goes on and on and on. All the things have been condensed into this, less than $1,000 phone. Well, you may have seen a deep fake that was done by Jordan Peele of Obama. And this is about 3.5 years ago. Okay. And that was one of the first viral deep fakes that went around. That took a team of about 30 people and about 3 weeks of computing time to crunch through and to do that video. And that video, as you look at it today, is not that great. There's artifacts in it. If you watch it over and over again, you'll see the colors are not right.
Right.
On Obama's face. Well, if you haven't seen it already, you should Google deep fake Tom Cruise. Really? And you will see a deep fake of Tom Cruise that was done with a cell phone and a computer. They captured on a cell phone, but a computer done by one guy in 24 hours.
Whoa.
Okay. So that's where we're getting to these problems, right? So now I could do the deep fake of Darren Parker with off-the-shelf materials for very, very cheap, right? And the reward might be great enough that I could, scam some money from your family or something like that. So that's a big problem. Is this accelerating quality of the technology as well as the democratization of that technology? And I don't have to be a programmer anymore to do that. I can run some scripts and all that kind of stuff. Well, the other thing is that, once again, we need to put some things in place. So Adobe is actually looking at this as being able to have things where you can have your phone capture video, but it puts a kind of a electronic signature on that video.
Okay.
So you may have heard of NFTs,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So they're really popular right now with art. Well, in some ways, it's going to make an NFT out of your video. And then we can track who that went to and whether they modified it. So an NFT doesn't have to be entirely unique. It's kind of like Well, you probably bought a photo or something someplace and it says 1 of 1,000, right? So
Right.
you can actually have it be like that type of art, that it's multiple copies of it, but it's still authenticated. You know it came from Scott Christianson's phone at this
Right.
time. And then if Darren takes that into his software and alters it, well, then there's a record of that too.
Okay.
Okay. And so we get to compare. I want to see the original and I want to see Darren's edits. Right. So if I've had any worries that this is a deep fake or something's been altered, then I want to be able to see that original. So there are technologies coming out. It's just a matter of whether we will have a common technology that will work across all systems, or whether we will kind of be balkanized, like it works when you run Adobe products, or it works on this blockchain or this blockchain. So there are technologies out there that are coming up rapidly, but unfortunately, it's going to be a while before they are universal.
Well, it feels like, how do you catch up though if the pace of innovation always outpaces the pace of parameters or safeguards? How do you, it seems like technology is just constantly going crazier and crazier.
Well, maybe we have to kind of flip the script, right? So right now, we basically do not regulate technology in the way it is used or deployed. And or if we do regulate it, we do it after the fact.
Yeah.
Right. So we do it after the fact. We say, okay, well, this is not good. This is bad for people, or that this is hurting commerce. So now we're going to put in some regulations. We don't see that a lot here in the US. Maybe we will with the new head of the FTC, but the EU is doing that, right? So they're saying, oh, you have the right to be forgotten. Google cannot always point to these entries of you. You have the right to edit your personal information. But once again, that's regulation after the fact.
Yeah.
Well, we don't do that with foodstuffs, right? So I can't, create Scott's magic elixir and I start selling it and I say, well, we'll just find out what happens. And then if we need any regulations, we'll deal with that.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Let the market decide. We don't do that, right? And we're starting to understand that some of these technologies can have such a huge effect on our mental health.
Yes.
We need to start with an a priori assumption that this product needs to prove that it will not have these negative effects, right? And the onus should be on the technology to say this is not going to have an onerous effect, or that it has been tested. So I think we talked last time about the movie Coded Bias.
Yeah.
That was one where it showed that African Americans were much more likely to be misidentified by facial recognition technology.
Right. And who's feeding the information for identification, for that? I also saw too that there may be some regulation on things like Instagram to like people to opt out of algorithms and recommendations. And I just started laughing. I was like, you mean like how it used to be? Like, before all this, like to go backwards and rethink, like, yeah, I don't want somebody telling me what I should be looking at, essentially, if I looked at something one time,
Right. And I find, I'm pretty hopeful, actually. I don't want to come off as being negative. I get pretty hopeful talking with my students, because when they look at this, when they start to understand this stuff, they don't want to be manipulated. They want to have charge of their life. They want to have that agency in their life. And so they're very skeptical of these big companies. And I think they ask good questions about what's being done with my data, or why is this happening? So
it feels like that a lot of students have that mindset, or people who are younger, probably in the age bracket that you're teaching. But also feels like people our age are not as up to date with that. Like they just fall into it very easily. They get scammed easily. They are on Facebook all the time or whatever, Meta. And like the younger people are like, maybe you guys should like think about this. Like we're not into this. It's a strange way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot of my students shy away from places where they are publicly posting.
Yeah.
Because of the horror stories they've heard of.
Hmm.
And so rightly so, they think, well, maybe I don't want to tweet this out there. Maybe I don't want to
Yeah.
have this out there. And what they do is a lot of Snapchat where they're just doing it with friends.
Yeah.
And so I think that's much healthier
Yes.
than, like you said, our generation's on Facebook and hasn't really thought about the fact that it's not like a website. And maybe we're
Yeah.
just naive because we were brought up with AOL and stuff in the 90s, and it's just like, oh, this is just another website, and we don't really understand, no,
Yeah.
this is something new. This has been manipulated.
Yeah. I think you might be right about, I mean, I think about all the iterations of technology that I've experienced, from like not having the internet essentially to having like email, never having email, to having email, to going on dial up, you know. So like, why, like, we've experienced so much of the arc of technology from its super infancy to as it continues to progress, where these young kids are like, hey, that's negative, that's bad stuff, we've seen, that's bad. Like, we've just
Right.
been like almost socialized into it over a really long period, you know?
Yep, I think it's very interesting too, because now I'm getting to the point where my students uh, have never lived during a time when there wasn't the internet.
Right.
So they were born in the early 2000s. And essentially, since their living memory, there have been smartphones. So probably
Yeah.
when they were 6 or 7, or maybe 5, smartphones were in their parents' hands. So
Yeah.
in the form of an iPhone or a Crackberry, as we used to call them.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
Uh, and
That's foreshadowing, man.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you're on it all the time, you know?
yeah, that was. And we thought those were bad.
Yeah.
I love my BlackBerry, though, I have to say.
Yeah,
It was kind of like the device from the future, kind of like the
exactly.
iPhone. But yeah, so they don't have that reference. And so
Yeah.
that's something that's very interesting to me, because they ask me things like, uh, well, you must have used Wikipedia when you were in college.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, I had an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
You
That's
know,
what the library actually.
right. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting. I'm encouraged by this generation, but
Yeah.
our generation does have it's good things,
Mhm.
but it has like you pointed out, kind of maybe haven't understood what it's like to live in this digital world.
Yeah. It's just a different perspective. Like, I've had guests who come on whose children tell them they don't like that their parents are always posting on Instagram and stuff, and they're always tweeting. Like, the kids tell the parents, you shouldn't be doing that, it's bad for you. How crazy is that, that the
Right,
kids they say, I had this one lady, she said, please stop taking pictures of me, mom, I don't want my image out there. Like,
right,
the mom is taking the pictures all the time. Like, it feel like it should be backwards, you know, like they should be safeguarding, not the kids.
right. I think the kids are smarter in this regard, and
They
they
are.
hear things about what has happened to other kids. Um, and so I think that's a good thing. I think you're exactly right. It's kind of our generation. It's out there oversharing sometimes.
Oversharing. Yeah. I mean, I never share anything like a picture or anything with my daughter, because I don't know if she actually wants that.
Right,
None. And she's only 10. And what's the lasting legacy of that? For that,
right,
it's her life. I mean, if she's an adult, she does what she wants, but like, is it my thing to be posting all this stuff? The other thing, like
right,
you said, the kids, like, they're sharing stuff on Snapchat between each other. It's kind of like, if you have a vacation picture of vacation, why don't you just share that with like people like you really know, versus like just sharing it with a bunch of random people. It feels very attention seeking, validation seeking. A lot of this stuff, the technology almost has created this addiction to validation. And
right,
please look at me, there's something deeply human about wanting to be desired by other people.
right. Yeah, and then maybe that's something with our kind of digital society is that
Yeah.
that's where we look toward. One of the things that I find disturbing with my fellow faculty members is sometimes I'll get on an elevator with them and, they're immediately on their phones.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I'm here. And then
Yeah.
I've also have this, one of the reasons I've resisted ever getting an Apple Watch is I've had so many experiences where I'll be in a meeting with somebody and they'll be sitting here,
Yeah.
flicking at their watch. And I'm like, well, why am I in this meeting?
I know.
Why do I need to be here?
Dude, I've had this with podcast guests. It's starting to happen with podcast guests where I could tell, because you can tell by the eyes, their eye movement, and they're on their computer. You can tell they're looking at other sites while you're asking a question or speaking to them. It's so obvious. Scott, it's so obvious. It's like, you're not even paying. You wanted to be on. Like, what is that? Like,
Right.
and it's as I see it happening more and more. And I'm like, this is a troubling trend, you know?
Yep. And it's just that kind of dopamine response, right? And
Yeah.
we're all subject to that. I like Reddit and the awe and the idiots in cars videos. Both of those I like. Well, I have to limit myself,
Yeah.
right? So I get like 15 minutes at night and I get 15 minutes in the morning. I'm having my coffee,
Yeah.
and that's it. Because otherwise, I will spend 2 hours doing that.
Exactly.
And so we have to set up these boundaries. And there's a really good book by Kyle Newport. I'm sure that you're familiar with it, called Deep Work.
Yep.
And that's that idea that we need to concentrate. How do we take the time to concentrate in order to produce something that is of value? Because are you going to sit there on your deathbed and think, oh my goodness, I scrolled a lot. That was awesome. Or hey, I really had an impact on this student. I helped them when things were down for them, and I took the time and I wrote them a letter and I got them, some help they needed. Am I going to look back that on my deathbed at all that? And I'd much rather do that. So, yeah, I think we need to consider, that's another thing too. It's just considering your own death. What if this is the last day that you had?
Yeah.
Would you really want to have said that you spent it that way?
Scrolling your last day. Well, I scrolled a lot my last day.
Right. I spent 5 hours on Instagram my last day
I saw a lot of pictures. Man, it was gratifying. You're like, what? Like,
or did you go for an extra walk and you actually weren't on your phone and you played with your puppy dog or with your loved ones? So I think we need to do more of that because, as you know, with being close to disasters, and we just had a series of tornadoes that went through here, and we didn't have that much damage in Missouri, but we had one where we had 110 people killed in Joplin, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago. And, it can happen at any moment, right? So
it can. How do you, in the terms of students, has it gotten easier or harder, or I don't know, maybe indifferent, like in working with students as you continue to get a new crop of students and technology continues to advance? Do you feel that technology is enhancing your work with students, or maybe in the other way, it's a negative aspect?
That's that's an interesting question. I think overall, as far as education goes, my industry, it has had a negative effect because what we try to do is optimize for different metrics that will move us up in rankings. And some of those metrics, just like we talked about with measuring GDP versus average lifespan, well, some of those metrics are the number of top people that we rejected. So if we can get really smart people to apply to our institution and then reject them, that makes us look like we're more elite.
Right.
Okay? And I'm on the other side, that we should be getting as much education out there to as many people as possible. And so as a whole, I think a lot of the technologies that are out there, some that are surveilling students when they are remote, So like there's Examity and Proctorio.
Oh,
So
really?
let's say you were my student and we were doing a synchronous class over Zoom. I might say, well, we're going to take a test today. And so there's going to be some person or an AI that you're going to connect to, and then you're going to have to show, your camera around,
Yeah.
show them the room, all that kind of stuff. And then you're going to have somebody that you don't know sitting there watching you taking the exam.
Huh.
And I absolutely refuse to use this software for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's an invasion of privacy. A lot of these students do not have an office to go to.
Right.
They have to do it in their home. Secondly, and this has actually just been proven out with some data that came out about 2 months ago, the stress of having this system that you don't know how it works, or if you're going to be accused of cheating or something, because there have been lots of cases of that, of students that weren't cheating, that were accused of it. That stress actually has a very negative effect on your performance. And I feel like as an instructor, I realize that's not true everywhere, but I'm generally paid pretty well.
Yeah.
And, I should be able to design an exam that is appropriate for open book, open note, that still is going to provide an effective assessment of that student's performance. And if I am lazy and say, well, I'll just use the one I did from last time, except I'll get a Proctorio thing to monitor my students, well, maybe I should find a different job at that point. So,
wow, I had no clue any of this was being done. I mean,
an
examination like kind of overlord in a sense, like a security system.
So it's a way to have your exams proctored.
Yeah.
That is through the computer, and it's monitoring those students. And
I
would argue that a good instructor should be able to come up with an assessment that can be done open book, open note. That still sees if the student can synthesize the information in a good way. And there's, in that regard, some of the technology tools. So for example, you can have students make videos. You can have them make presentations. And then what's really cool is we have this thing called VoiceThread, where I can go through and I can annotate with my voice. And I can say, hey, Darren, you really hit it here. This is fantastic, the way you explained net present value. Oh, hey, when you explain this part, it gets a little confusing. You notice how you did this and then you did that. Maybe if you reverse the order. So I can actually annotate with video and audio now. So there's some really interesting tools, but I'm worried that a lot of times these tools get used as shortcuts, right? Faculty are often overworked, and we're under pressure, and we want to move up in our rankings, and that's the way we're judged. So I think, for me personally, I'm pretty selective. So I actually make my students take notes by hand.
Oh, good for you, man. Good for you. I would do the same thing.
But we talk about why there's a brain connection there. And we talk about that. And we talk about why that's better than taking it on a computer. And we talk about the first day, so they don't just think I'm just old school. But they fill in blanks. I have things for them to do in the note pack. So I think you just have to be selecting the appropriate technology for the job.
What role does the university or professors, instructors, what role do they play in teaching digital literacy to students?
Well, I think we need to be doing that in all disciplines a lot more. And unfortunately, it varies to a high degree by the institution you're at. So I'm at what's called a Research One University, an R1 university. I think that's originally what they were called. There may be a different typology now, but the emphasis is on research, right? And not on teaching. I get to teach a lot of that kind of stuff in my classes because we're talking about business processes and technologies. And I would argue that in any area, whether you're in music or whether you're in fine arts, you should be talking about things like AI, because it's going to affect your industry.
Most definitely.
And I think we do see some of the better work at teaching this done at state schools as well as other smaller private institutions. We have one here in town, Columbia College, that's excellent. that does a really good job. They're not a research institution. They just focus only on teaching.
Wow, that's awesome. I feel like it's one of those things like should be a must because there's such a rampant spread of information, whether it's misinformation or good. There's just information more than it's like when your students ask you about Wikipedia. Okay, you know how great that would have been back in the day? Like
Right.
instead of like the whole process of having to go, it was harder to get information a lot longer ago. You really had to like, I mean, I remember going through book stacks and trying to actually even find the right book was a chore. And then
Right.
finding the information in that book was another layer of it. And, but there was a lot of work involved in that. And I feel like now everybody gets information, like any random person get almost any information, whether they know what to do with it, it's a whole other thing. But, you know,
Right.
it feels like this should be like a very big part of an education when you're even younger than college. It should be middle school, high school, all that stuff is a big part of the curriculum.
Yeah. Just understanding how to trust different sources,
Yeah.
how to use multiple sources, whether something is credible or not. We have these biases built into our decision making. If I want something to be true, there's something called a confirmation bias, where information that tells me that is true, I will take in, and anything that tells me that's not true, I will discount. Right.
Right.
And so we have to think about our biases, and one good exercise to ask yourself, well, if I think that this is true, what piece of information would make me abandon that belief? Okay. And so
Yes.
now let's go hunting for that piece of information.
Right. That's it's a good question. Yeah.
So there are ways to combat our biases. And another one that I think students often have is one called the survivorship bias, right? So you see the people like Mark Zuckerberg that were successful, that dropped out of Harvard and created their own business.
Okay.
Well, you don't see the 1,000 other people that dropped out of Harvard and are now, wishing they hadn't, right?
Exactly.
Because their business did not go as well. And there's lots of that with investing. I have a lot of students that are trying to invest in crypto and these other more speculative assets that normally you would say you'd only want a small percentage. Well, they're putting a lot of their money into it because they heard of some guy that did really well. And I'm like, yeah, you don't hear of the 1,000 other people that bought some NFT and it went to zero.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a big problem as well, especially in these things that seem really hyped, is to think about, okay, is this really a great thing, or am I just hearing the success stories?
Yeah, it's true. I often think of like, I was fortunate, like a lot of people who have a lot of like maybe terminal degrees or higher education, you will see a research study and you can break it down. Like I can get a research study, I can read through it, look at the methodology and look at how many people were in the study, statistical analysis. Like I know how to do that. But most of the people in my life have no clue about that. They read the abstract, they see the conclusion, they don't understand any of the others. Is this a meta-analysis? Is it longitudinal? They don't think about any of that stuff.
Right.
And while I learned that, I feel like it would be good for other people to learn that, not just because you're in a certain track of education. Like it should be more universal. Because you could cherry pick stuff out of research studies,
Yeah. Well, and as you also know, many of the things that are published are irreproducible.
Right.
They, in fact, you run the same study again and you'll get different results.
Right, exactly.
And so there was actually, I think it was called the irreproducible study or something like that. It was mainly in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And they find that there can be a lot of tainting of the subjects. So if the subjects know that like, oh, Scott wants me to eat the cookie, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever it is, or he doesn't want me to eat the cookie.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, it doesn't matter if you eat the cookie or not. They will skew toward a certain behavior.
Yeah.
And they found that in psychology, there's a lot of these papers that are deeply flawed,
Yeah.
and you have to read the methodology, and you have to understand that sometimes
Right.
when they're talking about, oh, this showed a this fold increase. Well, what scale is that? That's
Yeah.
kind of like my doctor sometimes recommends statins, and I really have decided I don't want to do that, because
Right.
when I look at those papers, it's like, okay, there's an increase of survivability,
Right.
but it's so if you compare within the study, it looks large, but if you compare it to the population in general, it's very, very small.
Right.
And I'm like, if I just walked an extra mile a day, that would probably do it, you know?
Yeah, most definitely. It's just things like that. Who funded the study? You know, it was just all these different questions that the general public is just eating information like on a regular basis. They don't know the behind the scenes of it. And I think it's important to question those things.
Yeah.
And, and often if you're if you're educated about things, you often will have more questions. But if you have no education, you kind of like, especially if you're distrustful of institutions, you tend to fall into this very closed-minded sense about information. Like, that's true. It has to be true. You know, you don't question it then.
Right. And I heard something from Ryan Holiday, who's an author, and he also has a YouTube channel, writes about Stoicism. And it was very interesting about the idea that I don't have to have an opinion on that. Right? So nowadays, it seems like, especially in America, we all have to have an opinion about everything.
Yeah.
Well, I know about technology. I know about higher education. Okay. And I know about a few other areas,
Sure.
but I'm not an expert in, what should happen in the Middle East.
Right.
Right. And there's a lot of complicated things going on there. And I have friends on different sides of, Israel versus Palestine and all this. I don't have to have an opinion about that.
Yeah.
Right. I shouldn't feel that I have to, because I have no expertise in that area. I have no research knowledge, anything else like that. Same sort of thing with a lot of things with the coronavirus, as far as like whether these patents should be extended or made public domain and all this. Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't read on that. I'm not an expert in this area. Maybe I don't need to have an opinion. Right. So just taking that choice and saying, I don't have to have an opinion on everything,
I think that's a good point to make. And it kind of goes to the technology, is things like, you don't have to like post about everything you're thinking.
Right.
Like I tell my daughter, I'm like, not everything you think has to come out of your mouth. Like, because your kids, that's what they do. They just say everything that comes to mind. And as a parent, you're teaching the skill of this nuance of like, when is this a good story or not? Do people think this is interesting or not? Is this the timing or the place to bring up something? And I feel like sometimes technology has taken that away from us. And we're like, everything you think is interesting. You think that other people will think. This hyper documentation of your life is important to a lot of people for some odd reason,
Yeah. Very ephemeral. We don't understand how ephemeral it is. Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot going on. This could be a huge, like 8-hour discussion, but we don't have that time. But Scott, I really appreciate you coming back again and arming people with some really good information. This deep fake stuff's pretty scary to me. I didn't know all the good stuff that could be done, but man, we got a long way to go if we're going to make it more positive than the negative aspect.
I agree. And I would just say to your listeners, talk about this with your family. Think about these scams. My mom gets these Dear Grandma scams all the time, where it's somebody trying to scam her. Look out for those, especially older people that are more vulnerable to this in your families. That would be a great gift for the new year for them if you help them figure that out.
Most definitely. Scott, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you.
Happy holidays, man. Have a good holiday.
You too.
All right.